Hi everybody, I'm Courtney Poole and welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, I am a nutritionist and one of the areas that I specialize in is in helping people heal with overeating and binge eating and look at their relationship to food. And in today's video, I want to start talking about body image. Now this is a topic I haven't talked about too much on my channel yet, so I'm really looking forward to creating a series of videos discussing it. Because I find that in my work with people and their relationship to food and helping them look at why their behavior is what it is, I find that inevitably body image comes up as a topic. And it becomes an important topic to discuss because not only can negative body image affect just your happiness and your relationship with yourself, but it can really affect like the actions that you take in your day-to-day life, and it can actually even affect the behavior that you have with food, what you do with food, and what's motivating what you do with food can be hugely related to what your body image stuff is. And so in the quest to heal our behavior with food, sometimes we have to really look at healing our behavior, or not our behavior, our feelings about our body image. So in this video, what I'm going to focus on to start out with is helping us look at where our body image comes from. So our particular body image feelings and beliefs, where do they actually come from? Where do they originate? And in future videos, I'll be talking more about how that's affected us, so you have these origins, you absorb these things, how could that have then affected you over your lifetime and with your behavior with food? And then, of course, most importantly, we will in future videos get to the topic of how you actually heal the body image issues, how you actually start to chip away at that and improve that. So my other disclaimer, I suppose, for this video is that I personally still have body image stuff, which in part is why I haven't made videos about it so far. But I've realized that even though I do have body image stuff myself still, I have come a long way. Like when I think about how severe my body image stuff used to be, how much it affected my day-to-day happiness, how much it affected my actions, my relationship with food, it's definitely changed actually quite a lot because it was pretty severe. So I've learned a few things about how to start healing that. And so even though I've got more healing to go myself, I think I have some things that I can share. So the first thing that I want to talk about as we talk about this issue of where body image stuff originates from is to talk about how we absorb things. So I feel that we absorb our emotions and attitudes and beliefs that affect our body image. I believe we absorb that in our childhood mainly, our adolescence and our childhood. And that's actually what I believe in terms of where we absorb most of our stuff, where most of our emotional damage or injury happens, or just where we're affected the most is during those formative years. And so what I want to talk about before we get into the specifics of body image is to talk a little bit about how that happens. So I'm always talking about the Divine Truth Material. They have great videos on just like the human soul and how it absorbs things from its environment, particularly when we're little and a baby and a child. And so as always, I'll link videos from them because they will go into much more depth than I'll have time for in today's video. But the cliff notes of all that is that the human soul starts absorbing attitudes, beliefs, emotions at conception. So you're absorbing things in the womb, and you were absorbing things when you were a baby. And obviously those times are pre-verbal. You can't speak yourself. You can't understand your native language, but you're going to be still absorbing things emotionally. Anyway. And then, of course, as you grow up, you start speaking, English or whatever your native language is, and then you can now absorb, you can understand things that are coming to you. But it's still really about what you're absorbing emotionally. So the attitudes and the beliefs and the feelings that you're going to be picking up from your environment. And so the thing to understand really is that we are like sponges as little children and babies. We absorb everything. We are incredibly sensitive. We absorb things that are overt, of course, but we also absorb more subtle things, the unsaid things, the things that sometimes parents and people around us think if I just don't say it, maybe the kid won't absorb it. But unfortunately, if it's in them, it's in their soul, we're probably going to absorb it as well. And so that's what we need to understand about where we absorb these body image issues from, is that first of all, I believe we absorb them primarily in our childhood and as small children and babies, and that we are very sensitive to what we absorb. We can't really discern certain things from other things, and that we also absorb things that are not said as well, and the more subtle, if you could call it that, kinds of messages. So that being said, I first want to look at this issue of our environment. Our environment immediately when we are growing up. So I feel that in this piece, what we need to look at is what adults were we around the most when we were, obviously when we're in the womb, we're going to be absorbing mostly our mother's emotions and feelings and attitudes and beliefs, but also other people in our environment when we're in the womb. And then of course, when we're babies, for most people, that's their parents that they're around, but it could be other adults, or it could be a nanny that you're around. So you want to look at who you were around the most as a child and as a baby and, your adolescence growing up. Because the people you're around the most are going to probably have had the most impact on what you absorbed. And not just with regards to body image. Like, I think this is just how it is with any emotion and any belief and any attitude. The fact that we're very sensitive and, that we absorb it from the people we spent the most time with when we were little. So I'm going to, in a little bit, I'm going to actually give you some very specific journal exercises and reflection exercises that you can use to feel about this stuff and kind of uncover more truth about where this may have come from for you. But just as an overview, what we want to really start looking at is, so I'm going to use the phrase parents in the rest of this video just because it's easier. But like I mentioned, if you spent most of your time, say, with a grandmother or a nanny or something like that, then for you, there may be other people in this mix. And certainly as we grow older, things like school teachers theoretically could affect this as well too. So just who we spent the most time with. But so if we look at your parents when you were little, what we want to start looking at is a couple different areas. One of them is, how did our parents feel about their own bodies? What were their body image, emotions, and attitudes within themselves towards themselves? How did they treat themselves when it came to their body? And you can look at things like what they did with food, because a lot of times what they did with food can reflect what their emotions were, right? So if you had a mother who was always quite worried about weight and always dieting and maybe had some strange behavior with food, that may illustrate what hers were. And also, their comments about themselves, right? So you want to look at that. We also want to look at what their emotions and attitudes were towards other people. So in other words, how did they feel about their spouse's body, or how did they feel about, how did your dad feel about other men's bodies? How did your mom feel about other women's bodies? What did they comment on? What were their just feelings and attitudes towards that? And then the third area is also what their feelings and attitudes were towards your body as you were growing up. So there's a few different areas, and typically all those things will really overlap. Like, most people don't have like a totally different set of body image feelings for themselves and then something totally different for, their friend. Mostly they line up, but they're just angles to help you kind of analyze what you absorbed and what happened. So I'm going to give you a few exercises, and I'm going to actually put these in the description box below, I think. If it allows me to write that much, hopefully it will. I also want to put a lot of my exercises up on my website at some point, which I think I will do soon. So check back to my website, which is courtneypoole.com, because I do a lot of these journal exercises for people, and I create some of them myself, and so I would like to put them up there for free for people. So I'm going to give you some of these journaling exercises, and after I read out the actual question that you'll reflect on, I'm going to give some examples of those things and, kind of angles you would look at. So the first question is, growing up, my family's attitudes about their own weights and bodies were. So you're basically going to complete these sentences. So growing up, my family's attitudes about their own weights and bodies were. So in here, like I mentioned just a little bit before, you're going to look at what comments did they make about their own bodies? Were they critical of their own bodies? Were they, or on the other end of the spectrum from being quite critical, were they kind of just like, I'm not caring for my body at all, like it doesn't matter, and perhaps they were kind of more on that spectrum. There's no right or wrong answer, it's just about analyzing what it was. So how did they treat their own bodies? What were their attitudes about their own bodies? How did they behave with food, which may reveal some of what they felt about their own bodies? So, for example, if you had, parents who were very critical of their own bodies, that's going to probably affect you a certain way. Even though they're not directing that criticism at you, it's still going to teach you something. And I'm not saying that teaching is true, but it's going to teach you something. So you want to look at that. The second question is, growing up, my family's attitudes about weight loss or weight gain were. So in this question, you're going to look at things like, were certain family members always trying to lose weight? Were they ever successful at that? Did they comment about it a lot? Or maybe they were even trying to gain weight. Some people have body image issues related to that. Were certain members supposed to gain weight and certain members supposed to lose weight? And, were they always on diets? Were they, really hyper-focused on food? It's kind of related to the first question, but it's slightly different because the first question is really about the body. And then the second question asks, did they constantly try to change that body? So were they interested in weight loss or weight gain? And how did that go? And what kind of comments were made? And things like that. And also looking at things like what emotions came along with that. So what I mean by that is if your mother was always really hyper-focused on weight loss, and then when she didn't lose weight, she got really upset, looking at that too. What emotions came along with these types of things too. So the third question is, growing up, and I'm looking at my notes, so I'm looking down. Growing up, my family's attitudes about other people's weights and bodies were. So in this question, you're going to be looking at things like, did they make fun of other people behind closed doors when that person wasn't around? Were they particularly critical? Were they mean even about, the way they talked about other people's bodies? Did they imply that, someone who couldn't keep their weight at whatever ideal they had, was pathetic or a loser, or what kinds of feelings did they have? Or did they get threatened if somebody got too thin? Did they sort of maybe prefer the people around them be bigger for some reason, which can happen. So just, again, there's no wrong or right. Some people grow up in these families of everybody's really thin and fit and they've got all this stuff around that. And other people grow up in families where everybody's really quite unhealthy and there's certain things around that. So we're just looking at what your mix of things was. And then the fourth question, and this is a really interesting question, is what was my family members like? What were their ideal body types? So what I mean by that is even though generally, you could say, a lot of negative body image comes from the idea that you're worth more if you're thin, it's better if you're thin, better things will happen if you're thin, and bad things will happen if you're not, and your worth is less if you're not. Even though there's like a general, swath you could paint with that, the reality is that most, or many people, most, I think, yeah, probably most, if you actually really diagnose the families and the parents' attitudes, there's like, they have a type that they think is the most ideal, right? So what I mean by that is, like, in some families, and for whatever reason, that our parents had in their own adolescence, which we don't need to entirely understand, but, in some families, there is a particular, let's say if we take women, for example, in some families, it is considered the ideal body type to be rail thin, like, 90s fashion model thin. In other families, it is considered more attractive, and their preferred type is something that is much more curvy. In some families, and this is what I'm encouraging with this question of, what were my family's ideal body types, like that they appreciated or admired or aspired to. Getting really specific. Were they really into butts? Big ones, were they really into big boobs? Were they really into like lips? Like what was their type? What did they consider attractive? And it might even vary, between parent or between adult, but like really looking at what that is. Because I know for me, for example, there was a very specific body type that my parents had, particularly my mom, that she thought was the most attractive. And so it didn't even occur to me until I was probably like early 20s that like any other particular type of body would be attractive. And now I think differently. But it was just, I was in such a tunnel vision because of the particular type that I was kind of groomed towards, thinking like this is the ideal and nothing, else is good. So really look at like what the particular type is and get as specifically as you can, if you can. Like I said, some families might be more general, but I think a lot of times, there are preferences. And when it comes to general weight or thinness or curviness or specific body parts or height or hair color or, really looking at that, because that'll tell you a lot too. And then the next question is for you to reflect on. So you finish this sentence. Growing up, my family's attitudes about my weight and body were. So here you're going to look at, did they comment on your weight, negatively or positively? What were you criticized for if you were criticized for? What were you praised for if you were praised for something? When were you praised? Was it never commented, was your body never commented on until you lost a lot of weight and then you got a bunch of praise? Were you made fun of a lot? Were you told as a small child that you need to lose weight? Looking at this type of thing. And as I mentioned before, you want to really look at things that are less overt too. So what I mean by that is that even if you had a parent or parents who didn't directly comment on your body, you want to look at like, but what could I feel from them? Did they have opinions about my body and things that they liked and didn't like or thought should change or wished would change, even if they didn't say it? Because like I mentioned before, sometimes parents at least know like maybe I shouldn't say it, but unfortunately we tend to absorb it the same even if they don't say it. And so really looking at like what their attitudes and feelings may have been towards my body and my appearance. Were they approving of it? Were they disapproving of it? And looking at those nuances. So those are the exercises that I want to have you start out with. But now in this next section of the video, what I want to talk about is another area that we absorb body image, emotions, and attitudes and beliefs from, and that is our media and our pop culture and all of these kinds of societal external influences that we get affected by. Now, I was a person who was very affected by pop culture and media and the things that were around me. I grew up in the 90s mainly, and so MTV and music videos and like teen magazines and stuff. And, you know, I was definitely affected by especially at that time, the, you know, standard of beauty and ideal body type. And I would compare myself to women that I would see in music videos and the women that I would see in beauty pageants and, you know, movies and magazines and all that, right? I was very affected by that. And so I do think that it's important to analyze, you know, what you grew up with, what kind of body type at that particular time in history or that particular year or decade, because it can even change that much, you know, what was considered the body type that was ideal at that time, and analyzing that. And I think that healing those influences from the media and pop culture is it's the same process as healing the stuff that we got from our parents. But the thing that I want to also really have you look at with, like, related to this issue of media and pop culture is look at whether your parents emotionally, regardless of maybe even what they said verbally, did they agree with the pop culture and the media? Because, like, look, I'm no, you know, sociologist and things like that, but my feeling is that how susceptible we are to being influenced by social media and by, you know, the pressures that we see in pop culture, my feeling is that that susceptibility is affected a lot by what we were around in our environment at home growing up. And when I say what we're around, what I mean is what our parents' feelings were. Because, like, so for example, for me, yes, I was affected by pop culture and all these things that I was seeing in the media. However, my family, my parents, and particularly my mother, 100% wholeheartedly, emotionally agreed with those standards. So there was no barriers for me to completely just be influenced by all that because I was getting the same messages in my home. So I actually think, you know, in a lot of ways, I was still affected more by my family than I was by the pop culture, and also the ability of the pop culture to influence me and for me to just accept it without even questioning and wholeheartedly feel like, yes, this is the truth. This is how I should look. Like, women are worth more if they look like, you know, I just completely absorbed it because I was having that emotionally reinforced in my home all the time. And so what I want to have you look at with this is to look at, like, did your parents' emotions or beliefs or attitudes match up in any way with pop culture? Did they oppose them? And, like, I know for some people, they have parents who kind of had the wherewithal, which I think is great, to sit down and go, like, hey, you're going to see this in pop culture and you're going to see this, you know, said about women's bodies and how they should look, and this is what you're going to be exposed to, but you need to know that, like, your weight is not related to your worth or something like that. And that is lovely. Like, I do often wonder if I had that, if maybe that would have impacted how much I was affected by media. I was personally never, like, that never came up because of the agreement in my family. But you know, it's kind of like looking like, did that ever happen? Did anybody have those kind of conversations with me? And also, even going further than that, I think what we have to recognize is that sometimes, even in those situations, a parent can verbally say that they don't agree with the societal norms, they don't think there should be that pressure, or they are careful not to comment on body and things like that, which is great. But if emotionally they personally haven't fully resolved their own body image issues, even if they're doing their best to try to not, like, you know, overtly just, like, live in those things, I think that you can still, as a child, end up being affected, you know, because if deep down, you know, your mother does kind of still feel ashamed of her own body, or does feel like if she is a bit bigger, she's not worth as much as you know, as a human soul, like, you are going to absorb those things. And so it is looking at, like, what are the parents' true feelings about the body types shown in media and and society at large, and their agreement or disagreement with that. So I hope that makes sense. So I want to acknowledge that media and pop culture and what we see affects us a huge amount, but I also want us to look at what we were predisposed to or protected from, or what kind of emotional agreement or disagreement with those things happened in our home, because I think that then affects how much we can be affected by social media and pop culture and things. So I hope this has been helpful. And in the future videos, as I mentioned, I will talk about, okay, so this happened, right? You're going to hopefully analyze and find some root causes of where some of this stuff comes from. But in future videos, like I mentioned before, I want to talk about, but how does that actually affect us? Like, how do we have that absorption, and how does that translate to what sometimes we do with food? Like, why does that translate that way? Why does it manifest that way? And then also in the future talk about, okay, now that we know all this, how do we actually start changing this set of feelings in ourselves? So that'll come next, but I urge you to start with these journaling exercises and let yourself feel about the messages you got, the things that you were taught overtly and subtly, and go with all that. So that's it for now. And you can always contact me if you want any coaching through my website, which is CourtneyPoole.com. And also, if you do want to donate, I do offer, all this material on YouTube for free, and you can do that through my website as well. So thank you so much, and hope everybody has a good rest of your day. Talk soon. Bye.